I'm waiting a little bit for Alexis. Do you want to tell us briefly about your new project? Is that?
Yeah,
that would
sure.
Be great.
So, hi guys. How's it going? You all look so fresh and young and awesome. Yeah, I can talk a little bit about. So, have you all seen you just watched the film, I guess?
Below Dreams. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So yeah, I can talk a little bit about what I'm working on right now, and actually, I wish I could show you guys my desktop because I've got a bunch of. I'm actually editing right now.
Oh, sorry.
A film that's going to be for the International Arts Biennial, Prospect 3, which is headed by Franklin Sermons. And for those of you who don't know who he is the head artistic director of LACMA, the Los Angeles County Museum. And is a really, really amazing, wonderful curator. So it's myself, and I think it's in total, I want to say 60 other artists of all different ages, totally different stages in their career, who've made work that's going to be presented in about a week and a half throughout various venues throughout New Orleans. And it's crazy because New Orleans is such a, I think we've got less than 500,000 people here now. And the fact that we have it's the largest international biennial in the entire country is in this city that has less than 1 million people in it, and it's certainly not, about the future so much. It's not like a New York City or Los Angeles. It's not one of those cities that fosters tons of contemporary in a certain kind of way. So it'll be interesting. And the piece that I've made is about New Orleans, kind of in the same way that Below Dreams is, but it's very different aesthetically. I was really trying to work with kind of the opposite approach that I did with Below Dreams. So I don't know if you guys noticed, there was a lot of movement in Below Dreams, right? Like to the point where sometimes people were like sick in the theater. And that was an intentional choice, which I can talk about later if you guys are interested in that. But for me as a filmmaker, I was like, well, how can I work with this same tool, right? Because for me as a filmmaker, the whole thing I'm really interested in is like trying to blur that line between your eye, right, my eye, and then the eye of the camera. So when you're watching something, when you're watching a film, you really feel as though the movement is motivated by your own interest and your own curiosity and your own insight, and there isn't so much that barrier between my vision as a filmmaker or the vision of the camera and yourself as an audience, if that makes sense. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So another way to do that, rather than working with really tight lenses and a tight focal distance, which is a lot of what Below Dreams was. I mean, if you see it on a big screen, sometimes one person's space fills up the entire screen. This is completely the opposite with this new film. I'm working with zooms. I was working with a lot of zoom cameras, starting from, I think we were like from a 25 to a 200, right? And so I'm sure you guys, I'm not sure how much production stuff you've done. I know that you're going into production, but the higher the number in millimeter size, the tighter the frame, right? The smaller the picture is. So a 25 is really, really wide. You can see my feet. You could see probably this whole room. Whereas a 200, you'd see maybe like a corner of my eye, like a pore, literally. So I was, it was a lot of static shots that are actually moving in the same way that Below Dreams is, but within the camera itself, within the lens. And for me, the justification in terms of when we begin that zoom, so it's a very intuitive process in terms of the cinematographer, right? It's not just like, okay, well now we're gonna focus on this, so we're gonna zoom in here. No, you have to think in terms of how does my eye move, right? So you may be looking at me right now on the camera, on this screen, but there's other stuff behind me, right? There's like a table, there's a bunch of other crap back there. Your eyes may start to wander there, and then you may start to focus on that. And the minute that subconscious focus starts to happen, that's when that's when the camera starts to move, right? That's when we start to use the zoom. So that's what allows it to feel intuitive.
Right.
I could go on and on. I don't know if there's, so anyway, that's, just kind of riffing off of Below Dreams and having seen that. It's a very different visual approach, but also kind of trying to stay consistent with myself as a filmmaker in terms of like, again, blurring that line and that distance between what you're watching and then who you are.
That's great. I wanted you to just, well, for one, I was waiting for us to come back from break, but I wanted to highlight that you made your first feature and then shortly after went into making, this will be a feature-length film as well. And I love that story because, we both went to UCLA, and LA is a place where you can wait forever to make a film. I mean, and it's the weather's the same, so it's like the same sunny day, day after day after day. Years will go by. And so I love the way, I think you talked in one interview about, and this is a thing I believe in just out of necessity, but turning limitations into creative stylistic choices, right? So making them part of your technique rather than something that you're trying to hide or cover or pretend isn't there. And I think just talking about making Below Dreams, I have questions, but I know that they all have questions as well. And already I see Alexis has her hand up. So I want to just jump in more informally, but just talking about your approach. We both went to a school that was very traditional in its narrative filmmaking style, and yet, just to talk about the choice of how you made Below Dreams, the ways that you worked with your actors, and and also we were talking about the use of sound and score in it, and having some really interesting conversation about that. But so we'll just go kind of free form into it. I think there's enough to talk about here. But Alexis, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah.
I don't know if you can see everybody.
Kind of, just kind of.
Yeah, just stand up and get yourself in the frame. Don't be shy.
Yay!
Okay.
That's a good one.
Hi. Yeah, you were talking about the relationship between the eye of the filmmaker, the eye of the camera, and the eye of the audience. And I feel like there was a particular, something I'm trying to work out about the film that I'm not quite concrete on. Because I felt like the film was incredibly observational. And when I think about the mode of the observational camera, I think about documentary. So the eye that I'm getting from the film is really the filmmaker's eye, that I'm not having knowledge just dispensed to me, but it's knowledge coming filtered through what the filmmaker sees. And I felt like one example when Jermaine is at the table with his girlfriend and the kids, I felt like simultaneously I was at the table myself, and then that I wasn't at all, that I was observing from a distance what was going on. And another example would be in the opening, which I really love, that long conversation that two people were having at the bus stop. I kind of felt like that was an extreme observational moment where I could have been out there smoking a cigarette from the position where the camera was, just overhearing their conversation. And so I was wondering if you had any explicit stance on whether you wanted the viewer to feel like they were in the city, or if they were observing the city from an outside standpoint. Because I feel like the handheld camera work too in the city, kind of when you're walking down the street in a new place and there's so much going on and it's just fleeting images coming by. I felt like in those moments, I felt like I was really immersed in the city, and sometimes I wasn't. I don't know if that makes sense.
I'm trying to. Okay, so there's a lot of things you're saying there. So it's documentary, it's narrative, it's immersive, but it's also kind of distanced, right? And how do we compensate for all those things, or what was the process?
Yeah, I'm wondering if you wanted it, how you wanted it to feel. If you wanted us to feel immersed in the city, or if you actually wanted that play between feeling immersed and feeling distance.
Okay, yeah, good question. Yeah, so I ride my bike all over the city. I mean, every city I've lived in, I don't drive. I'm not a good driver, so I bike everywhere. And that informs a lot of my work, right? And so as you were saying very eloquently, when you go to a new place, or even if you're in a place that you recognize, there are these constant kind of corner of the eye moments. I call them corner of the eye moments, right? These things, these scenarios, individuals, these moments that are just gems that you can never kind of recreate, that you see, right? On my bike, if I'm stopping for 3 seconds, I see something that's that speaks, to like the human condition, you know what I mean? That can say so much in just 2 minutes of noticing it, right? And then I get back on my bike or the light changes and I keep biking, you know what I mean? I keep going through the city. So this film was sort of a recreation of that experience, these sort of corner of the eye moments, right? So when we see Elliot and how we're talking at the pit stop, that's a really good example of a car driving by may have seen that for a second, right? But they don't have the luxury of sitting there and actually listening to the conversation. So this film, on one hand, is sort of a political stance, right? Because I'm sort of forcing people who are sitting in that space to sit and listen to that conversation until those people are done speaking. And that's part of what's important for me, because when you think about who those characters are, who these people are who are speaking and what it is that they're saying, it isn't simply about having a long static shot. It's about, well, you may get bored at moments. You may not want to listen. You may get restless, but that's what happens in the real world. And actually, sometimes people are saying things that are important that never really get listened to. So that balance between, I guess, as you were saying, doc and narrative, or sort of observation and distance, has to do with one, moving, right, like we do in the real world, and two, having the luxury to sit with people for those moments that in the real world we are not given the opportunity to do, right? So that stop and start is sort of a recreation of what I think happens every day.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah, good question.
Yeah. Yeah, Nigel.
So your actors, where did you find them? How did you train them? How prepared were they prior to your training of them? And do you feel that training them kind of took away from the authenticity
Authenticity, yeah.
of the kind of acting in film?
Could you hear him?
Yeah, did I think the rehearsal process took away from the authenticity of their performance?
That was one of the questions, yes.
Yeah,
So,
so I cast them, well, Elliot, who is sort of the like unfulfilled character, which, he's sort of the floater. We see him in New York, we see him in New Orleans, we see him back in New York, right? His story is very unresolved and kind of unclear, ambiguous. I had more footage with him than any of the other characters. So I just mentioned that because people find his character very frustrating, and I can talk about that in another moment. But Elliot was somebody who I had actually worked with at UCLA just in school on like various plays and little things that I had kind of written for classes actually. But Elliot and Leanne and everybody else that you see in the film was cast off Craigslist, or people who I just kind of like run into, or like for instance, Andrew was he was the handyman at the apartment that I was living in at the time. He was the guy on the scooter with Jermaine. And he's just like a character and has a lot to say, and is born and raised in New Orleans, and is like a very interesting guy. So I can tell you a little bit about the process. So I was at UCLA. It was in my, I think, third year in the master's program. I was 23. I started graduate school when I was 22, right? I went right to college doing experimental film and decided that I really wanted to get a sense of kind of more traditional styles of filmmaking and like how to like learn the tradition of it, right? And I was not prepared. In retrospect, like I really should have thought more about that, but I got into UCLA. I was like, great, this is awesome. But I was 22 and I was in a class with people who were like 10 years older than me and really had lived in the real world and had a real plan. They were like, I am here to make these specific films in this specific way. And I was really finding myself, I also didn't have an intention of making traditional films. I wasn't there to be that kind of filmmaker. I am going to get to answer your question, by the way. This is just sort of a little bit of backstory, right? And I found myself being very frustrated at a certain point because I was learning what I needed to learn and I knew how to make a slick film now, but it wasn't fulfilling to me in any kind of way. And New Orleans had been on my mind, and so I started traveling to New Orleans on these Greyhound buses, right, and like meeting people my age and doing these interviews. And then this article came out that obviously proved to be a pre-existing conversation which this film could fit into, right? So I left Los Angeles. I literally got in my car and drove to New Orleans. I didn't know anybody there. And I thought, okay, well, I'm gonna try to make this movie the right way, like the way that I was taught in school. And I'm gonna find a casting director and a producer, and I'm gonna make this movie. And that didn't work out. I tried a lot of casting directors. I mean, I think I probably at least 20 different casting directors of varying degrees of expertise. You know, some of them probably were not. I probably wouldn't even wanted to work with them. But nobody was interested. Everyone was just like, this is really janky. I don't know what this is. The script is not really it's not traditional. It wasn't anything that looked like money to anybody, I guess, or it certainly didn't have any famous people attached to it. It didn't have any of those things that a script typically tries to be in order to get support.
Can I ask you one question about the script?
Yeah.
Was it written out? Was it an actual feature-length script? And
Yeah.
then, if you can address this later, how much did it change in the process of working with the actors?
Sure. Yeah. So at this point in the process, it was a traditional 70-page script. That just looked like a real script. and that's what I was submitting to people, and that's what people were not interested in. And so, getting to your question more directly, I resolved at that point to just cast the film on my own, essentially, right? Because I felt like the material was time sensitive for myself as an artist, right? Sometimes you guys come up with ideas, and I would encourage you to execute those ideas as quickly as possible, because the next thing is going to come up and then you're going to want to do the next thing, right? But the only way to actually create work is to do it while it's in you, because you're not going to go backwards. It's not going to be interesting for you. So I realized that, and I was like, I'm just going to have to do this by all means possible. So I started posting things on Craigslist, right? That was the impetus for it. It wasn't because I wanted to work with non-professional actors. That was not the intention going into this project. It was purely by artistic and social necessity that I did that. I also put flyers up near women's clinics, near federal buildings, and near college campuses. So those are three sort of physical spaces that I felt the characters would naturally inhabit. Someone like Leanne, for instance, who doesn't have health insurance, who's got kids, who needs gynecological support or something, she's going to go to these women's clinics. That's where she's going to be. That's where a lot of women go to get support. Federal buildings, if you've had issues with the parole system, you have to check into the federal buildings, right? You've got to go there on a regular basis. College campuses as well. So then I spent several months basically just sitting in a cafe. I said in the Craigslist, if you fit this description, if you're a single mother, if you've had issues with the parole system, if you're a college graduate and you don't know what to do with yourself, come to this location at Hay Cafe between 9 and 6 p.m. And I was there every day for maybe a month and a half, 2 months. And I met hundreds of people who all fit this demographic. And for me, that was just so validating to know that this was a community that really did exist. It wasn't just, 3 people that I ran into on a bus. It was like there's so many people that this speaks to. And I eventually just whittled it down to working with Leanne. And it's funny, each of the characters had different reasons for why I also couldn't cast them, right? A single mother is not going to be that available, typically. So it was very hard to find someone who could even make it to the audition, first it started off as a conversation, then it was more of an audition process, then it was like a rehearsal process. So I whittled it down really just based on trust and availability and just what I sensed as their ability to take direction. And then we spent about half a year rehearsing, and that was presenting the script that I had, learning the lines, but then also I spent a lot of time at these people's houses, with Jermaine with his family and with Leanne. I babysat the kids. I had no money, so I wasn't able to pay for rehearsal time, but I was able to pay for babysitting, for instance, which helped Leanne out a lot. Jermaine, I thought he really resonated with this character, and I was lucky to know that the character I wrote, who really was trying to get his gold teeth removed, Jermaine really wanted this as well in his own life, right? And so I said, well, I can't pay you, but I'll pay to get your teeth removed. And if your teeth get removed, you may actually get an opportunity to enter the world in a new way after this film is over. And And maybe that's better than like paying you a certain amount of money, which will only last so long, you know. And yeah, so that was, so the rehearsal process was, you know, about 6 months or half a year, maybe a little bit more. And we had conversations too, so some of the dialogue was rewritten. But then at a certain point, it became, after we got through a lot of the technical stuff, like just memorizing lines and talking a lot about location, like where are the natural spaces that we want where we want you to be talking, going through blocking, all of that stuff, then it just became very fluid, you know? Then it was just a matter of like bringing in the camera, just to be there sometimes, just so that people would get used to having a camera around, also for the kids to get used to having a camera around. And really, I mean, that what you see on screen is just a result of trust, you know? I had very specific boundaries and very specific vision for what I wanted, and I was able to execute that because they trusted me. And because I spent time with them, and because I was very clear about what it is I was doing. And I think that's a very important thing, because right now in independent film especially, there's what they're calling sort of hybrid cinema, which I think is, Silas, I don't know what you think about this. I mean, I find it to be kind of a problematic term, just because it seems to negate kind of what you guys are learning about right now, like neorealism, which is essentially what we're now calling hybrid cinema, you know? Yeah. This is a tradition that's existed for a very long time, working with non-professional actors in real spaces. So I feel like I'm going on a bit of a tangent now. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
I have a couple questions, and I will try to keep it quick. But one, I'd like to talk about the hybrid cinema. But before that, can you break down a little bit more the rehearsal process? And if I know my first feature, people thought we improv'd a lot because of the style of dialogue, but it actually was scripted. And I guess I'm curious how much was scripted and how much was improv, because also it's very tricky to film improv, and it can be. And so if you could talk through a little bit, because they're about to do scenes where they're going to be non-professional actors for each other. They're just going to do dialogue scene, kind of like, did you study with Jula?
I did, yeah.
You know, he has that, you do a scene, everyone does sort of the same scene. But if you could talk about, that breakdown of the rehearsal process, just in some detail, and then how much improv.
Sure. So the process that I worked with was actually something that I learned not from Jula, but from Rory Kelly, who is a professor also at UCLA in the MFA program, was something called knowledge, emotion, action. Huh. So we know something, we feel something based on that information, and then we act accordingly. So for every line that I wrote, literally in the script, I had a knowledge, emotion, action, sort of in parentheses underneath those lines. That's how kind of refined it was. So when Leanne gets in the car and she says, which, I mean, this part was cut out, when she says, you know, thanks for picking me up, it wasn't just the line, thanks for picking me up. It was like, she knows that her mom's pissed off, right, about the fact that she even had to pick up her daughter. She feels really guilty about it. And she's, you know, trying to sort of like appease her mom in some kind of way. I mean, that's just me, just making that up off the top of my head. But that intention and that sort of mini history was behind almost every line in the script, and that's what we worked on in the rehearsal process. It was not the improv, you know, to be honest with you, there was the improv, I don't know if it's traditional improv, because if it wasn't lines, it was me sort of giving direction in terms of action, you know? Like, okay, Leanne, we're in the morning now, we're gonna go to school, let's brush Lex's hair, right? She didn't need me to like micromanage how to brush her daughter's hair. So I guess that was improv to a certain extent. She was just sort of doing it naturally, but through direction. I don't know if that helps. There was a lot of like the physicality, I guess, that was to a certain extent improv, but in terms of the lines, we really worked with that rubric.
Yeah, that is helpful. Great. So who else now? Colin.
Hey, so I had a question about the visual elements of the movie, because it did feel like a lot of the narrative did feel very visual. So you had a script. How did you kind of anticipate how the visuals would interact with dialogue, and then how kind of planned out were those visuals before you shot, and then once you had the footage, how did that kind of inform your editing decisions about the dialogue, so that everything kind of integrated with each other?
Good question. So two things. One is once simultaneous to actually going through the rehearsal process with the actors, I was working with Milena and Brian, who were both cinematographers, so I had two cinematographers, right? Milena comes from more of a documentary background. And what I mean by that, and this sort of answers one of the questions that was asked earlier, is that she has a very strong ability to act intuitively and impulsively and sort of spontaneously, while also maintaining a sense of control with her camera, right? So she's constantly observing not just what she's looking through, but she's aware of what's happening around her at the same time, and is able for that reason to really capture things that feel like it's physically coming from your eye, right? Brian has a really different background. He comes from more commercial filmmaking and does like a lot of setups, so like highly staged, well like lit scenarios. So I'm somebody who shoots a lot of stuff on my Instagram, right? Like I'm always on Instagram. And so I showed a lot of my photos and a lot of the videos that I have on my cell phone with Milena, and I said, this is the eye, this is your eye. This is the kind of stuff that I want you to be looking for. This is how I want you to move with it. A lot of the time I was her AC too. So we would be just underneath.
Can you tell them what an AC is?
Oh yeah, sure. So that's an assistant camera. So that's somebody who actually pulls focus. So you have, and we looked we looked crazy, but she had like a 5D. You guys know what a 5D Mark III camera is? These little cameras. That's what we shot the film on. So she had one of these guys, and then this hoodie we would put over our heads, and then I would be next to her looking in the monitor and pulling focus. So I would be deciding where the focus was, and it's a very intimate thing because we're working together, right? And we would just be you'd see us from a distance, and you'd see 2 feet underneath a huge sweater, just kind of like bumping into stuff. And
like conjoined twins in a second,
yeah.
Attached at the head.
So in terms of the being able to anticipate then once you incorporate actors, that was all blocking. That was just literally working with the characters and saying, you are going to go from this point to that point. And the actors knew that, and then Milena and Brian, when they were filming, knew that too. And they would be able to incorporate, understanding the rules of the cinema, like the rules of the imagery, which was movement and all of that. That's essentially what you see, right? In the editing process, it became a completely different thing because I decided sort of once I started editing that when the camera turned off, right before Milena or Brian were about to turn off their camera, the camera would like whip down, right, or like go to the left or something, right, because like they were about to shut off. I wanted to work with that because it sort of created this like beautiful, just these like washing colors, that really created an interesting way of like creating transition. So I left that in. And then it became kind of highlighted and really important when I started working with Eric Cohen, who did the sound design. And I said, we need to have a sort of sonic reference for that movement. So we started creating sound effects, like little shakes or even street horns, like something that is directly on top of a specific movement in the camera. And that's what makes it feel harmonized. Incorporating all those layers. So for you, I mean, if you're making your film, I think you want to think about like, how do I want my characters to inhabit their space? How do I want the camera to elicit that either emotionally or even just objectively in terms of like where they are, like in terms of the context, right? And then once you're in the editing room, you can kind of say, well, where's my fingerprint on this? And how do I want to like say the things that I've captured here, but then bring it to the nth degree with sound, you know what I mean? Or with music or with color, color correction, Hopefully that's answered your question.
Yeah, for sure. One other quick practical question. How did you fund this project?
How did I fund it?
Yeah.
Well, some people would say I didn't really fund it. There's a term called no budget, apparently, but so luckily because I went to film school, I was able to get some like award money for my thesis film, and it was about $12,000. and then I saved that money and I didn't put it towards making a 20-minute film. I actually saved it and then did a Kickstarter, and I think we raised about $17,000 on that. And then the rest of the money came from like individual donations, so like family members, friends, $25 here, $500 there. And I did two things to raise the money. One, I resolved that whatever amount of money I got at a specific date, which I think was like January something, because we shot in February of 2011 or 2013. I don't remember actually. 2011. I just resolved like whatever amount of money I have at this date, that's what the budget's going to be. You know, and I also set my Kickstarter. You know, I mean, listen, I'm going to tell you guys, and Silas, hopefully you won't think this is unethical to tell your students, but I set my goal at $1 on Kickstarter, right? And I spent a lot of time, like months, really perfecting the language that was presented on my Kickstarter so that it was adamantly clear in my emails that I sent out to people and the promotion of the page that I was actually trying to raise, I think, $25,000. Right? So people knew what it is I was trying to go for. But as far as Kickstarter was concerned, once I made $1, all that money was going to come to me.
Oh,
right?
That's so smart. I'm absolutely behind that.
Yeah.
I've done a few Kickstarters, and it's, you know, they're a pain and all of that, but you do have to learn how to market your film and reach, you know, you can use it, but that's such a great idea. I'm all for any kind of way around systems. So that's just between us and here in Williams. But also I think you said an important thing, and I've done this as well with the two features that I've done, where basically I say I'm going to shoot regardless of my budget at a certain date. You know, that kind of commitment. And I remembered I got my producer because I said that. I was like, we have this amount of money, which I actually didn't even have that much yet, but I knew the amount I had was too small. I was going to lose her. And she's like, well, will you shoot if you don't raise the rest? And I said yes and meant it. And I think that kind of momentum, that sort of, you know, getting yourself committed to shooting regardless of a number, as long as it's some amount of money. It does take money to feed people and to shoot for a certain amount of time. But anyway, I like that you specified that. I think it's an important piece that for people that do want to go on to do projects and are interested in funding, there's a lot of magic around the economics of film and fundraising and creating a momentum to get a project up and running that can be very daunting, especially in this country. I mean, I think other countries there's funding from other sources, but here no. Especially not for narrative. Narrative's very, you know, very limited to find, you know, alternative funding for any independent film. So anyway.
Yeah, and for you guys, I mean, I would encourage you all to, you know, don't think about I find it's helpful not to think about the logistics and the money, right? You really want to focus on telling your story, and then you let all of that stuff come into play, right? I mean, I think that's just like a lesson for life. Like, you have dreams in your life and you have things that you want to accomplish. You don't look at the obstacles first, right? You need to be looking at what it is that you want, and then you roll with the obstacles as they come, that you want to keep a forward momentum.
In terms of like, I'm Gabby, by the way. Hi. Was there a particular order in which you shot the scenes? Was it just convenience, like spur of the moment? I don't know, how did that compare to a plan?
We shot, so it was a 16-day shoot, and the way that it was in February, we started in New York. We started in New York, we shot, I think, a week there. And I got lucky because we had a bunch of like really legit, like big time movie guys, like union guys, who usually actually are very grumpy, but these guys were not grumpy. They were really, really cool. And so we had a gaffer, and the gaffer is the person who controls the light, right? They're sort of like, there's a cinematographer, right? The person who's, you know, typically shooting, right? And then they have their assistant camera, and their assistant camera helps them, you know, set up their camera, change their lenses, do the focus, right? A gaffer kind of also does the same thing for the cinematographer, but specifically in terms of light, controlling the light, shaping the light. So it's really important. We didn't use any lights; we were using all natural light. But So I got a bunch of crew guys, our sound guy too, who were off in February. They weren't shooting anything in February. And they, like, this was the most janky film they probably ever worked on, and I think they were just having a lot of fun. And so I was able to convince them to come to New Orleans with us, because we had another week and a half scheduled to shoot in Louisiana, but we didn't have a crew yet. And we were kind of getting back that way. So I was like, listen, y'all are having a really good time, obviously. They'd never been to Louisiana or New Orleans, and it was such an easy job for them that they agreed to come down for free as long as I paid for their lodging and their food. So I didn't have to pay them a day rate, which helped a lot. And also just speaks to sort of like the communal nature of the shoot, right? People will help you if you're good to them, if you're kind to them, and they can see that you have a creative vision. And even, I think it's incredibly important as a director that you really keep yourself in check with your stress level and your creative vision. Like, you can't take it out on people. You have to just say to yourself, I am going to do everything. And even the impossible. And when people let you down or whatever, you can't hold it against them. You just gotta keep moving forward, right? This happened constantly throughout the shooting process. We were trying to shoot in order. Actors just wouldn't show up, you know. I mean, I can't even, every possible thing that could have gone wrong went wrong, and there was no one to blame, right? I just had to come up with a solution really quickly. And as long as you're kind to people and you're nice, they'll go with the flow and you can keep it moving, you know?
Good answer.
Yeah.
Are there other questions? Because you know I'll start talking and I'm just not stopping.
President Howard mentioned that you had an arts background before going to film school. Was it, you said something about experimental film, or what was your?
Yeah.
When you were
I
my
started.
age, what were you doing?
Say that again.
When you were my age, what were you doing? Well, I was 21.
How old are you?
I'm 21 already, so it's like.
Already?
I've been
Over the
through it.
hill.
When I was in high school, my stepdad gave me a camcorder, like one of these janky camcorders that I still have and love, and still shoot stuff on. And I made a documentary about my dad, who my parents split up when I was 2, and they're both painters and have a terrible relationship. I don't think they've seen each other since I was probably 2. And both live in New York, and I didn't have much of a relationship with him, so I would just like meet him at this bar and bring my camera and just like film him. I didn't really know why. Kind of how I made Below Dreams, I guess, now that I think about it. And then I started filming my mom, and then I was lucky enough to be at a Quaker high school that had editing facilities, and my teacher taught me how to edit. This like weird, it was like a weird console thing, and so I made that film, and then he encouraged me to submit it to a film festival, and it called the Bridge Film Festival, and it won the big award. And at that point, I was like, oh wow, this was actually really fun and like really validating, and I'm gonna keep doing this. So I made a bunch of documentaries. I made like 5 or 6 little small documentaries when I was in high school, and then once I got to college, I was doing way more kind of like, experimental is sort of silly, but it was just like a lot of sound work. It was like visuals that were mixed with sound, that were mixed with like me being kind of upset about being in college and whatever, you know, angsty stuff I would never show anyone. And then at that point, that's when I was like, oh man, I really feel like I need to like keep going. I need to push myself. I need to know technique a lot better. I need to like, I know that I can kind of expand this in some other kind of way. So that's why I went to film school. And then I made really, really traditional, not very good films that were just like, you know, about people. Not good, but technically accurate. You know, they're like very, very, you know, we did all the coverage and we're cutting back and forth and everything looks super slick and good. But so anyway.
Was that in undergrad? Sorry, Garrett. Was that undergrad or grad school that you're talking about?
Undergrad was sort of like the experimental.
Okay.
High school was documentary. College was experimental. Graduate school was traditional.
I went to UCLA, and I also feel like, as I made a feature before going to UCLA, so I feel like I went there to make some really bad shorts and get them out of my system, but learn, you know, what I was doing. I mean, I studied, I homeschooled before I made my feature. And but then I went to UCLA to learn, because I also acted in my feature, so to learn to work with actors. I feel like I learned technical stuff and then had to go back to an intuitive style that was my own. So it was a blend of the two, and I think it's great to know those rules. Like, I really like what I learned there, even if in some ways it stilted some parts of me, because now I can, understand how to utilize those or subvert some of those narrative or lend, or even like shooting styles or rehearsal styles. So anyway, and I like that you have that background as well. So you have this choice to, again, going to do Below Dreams. I guess I know we have about 20 more minutes. I wanted to also get a chance to talk to you about, I guess, that style of, choosing that style after learning a bunch of, proper coverage and this and that, and then maybe a bit of a non sequitur, but then the sound work. We were talking about a bunch of different scenes, but I was talking about the birthday party with the blowing up the balloons and how the sound was, we were intimately close with a number of people in that room. The audio. In other words, we're looking at somebody, but we're hearing someone blow up the balloon, and that kind of cacophonous approach in certain sections, some of the sound design, and I know that you use that in your experimental, aka silly, film background, and if you could talk about that as well.
Yeah. I'm trying, okay, so I think that the way I was able to find my style was because I had the confidence to find my style, and I think that that's really important for you guys to take into account. Again, going back to like my parents being painters and coming from the art world in New York, it's such a different set of rules that artists have to follow versus what filmmakers in the industry have to follow. Artists have such creative freedom, and actually that freedom is what ends up to a certain extent dictating the market, right? And as filmmakers, we feel a lot of the time pressure to function on sort of the flip side, on exactly the opposite way, that the market is somehow dictating what it is we're supposed to be making, right? Like, you want to make a film that is a part of a certain style, or gets into a certain kind of festival, or that is marketable in a certain kind of way. And I think that you have to kind of let go of that. And so I was able to say, I know what my history is. I know the history of cinema. I know the technical, I know how to make a certain kind of film. But I have to kind of let go of that, sort of, as you were saying, Silas, and just really work intuitively and just do what feels right and not worry about making mistakes. And I think that you have to, if you're not scared, right? If you're not feeling uncomfortable, I think that you need to push yourself a little bit more. In some kind of way, and I can't tell you in what way. And that's a very general statement that I mean on a more intimate level that you guys will know individually for yourselves, I think. So I'm sorry, Silas. Tell me, am I answering this question?
Yeah, no, that's actually perfect. Just to address the choices and sort of learning and unlearning, and then the other question was about sound.
Right.
Sound work. Unless somebody has a question that they want to interject. No, sound work? They want to talk about sound too. So
yeah, so sound is really important, and that's actually in this film I'm working on right now. I'm sort of proposing, it's more about sound, and proposing that sound actually is just as important as picture, right? And so sometimes we don't see anything at all, but we hear a bunch of stuff, and vice versa. So I think that there's a couple different layers to sound. It's so complex. On one hand, there's a couple things I'll throw out here. Sorry, I'm trying to be as clear cut for you guys as possible. So when I wrote my script, I actually had cues on my script for where sound would be coming in, or where score would be coming in. I'm sorry. That helped me kind of create an emotional framework that I could anticipate, and that I could also then really clearly see when in direction, when I was actually seeing a performance. I I can start to hear music at a certain point, and I can really know, okay, well, this is how this is all going to kind of stack up on itself. The sound effects for me, I really look at as its own art form, and it isn't just about facilitating any kind of reality. It's for me more about creating a new way of being creative, And sometimes it's logical, and sometimes it isn't logical. Sometimes it's diegetic, sometimes it's non-diegetic, right? You guys have heard that term before?
Yeah.
So that's something as an artist and as a filmmaker that you should play with, and I played with that. I definitely just was like, I want to feel like we're in the city, I want to be loud, I want to hear honking horns, but I also want it to be a way that connects space that isn't actually in real life connected, right? And so a lot of the time, so actually the way that I worked, so with Brian, who did the score, he comes from a percussion background. He was one of the members of the Dirty Projectors. He's one of the drummers in that band. And I sort of had a powwow. Basically, I had a conference call with the two of them, and I was like, listen, guys, y'all are not going to step on each other's toes, but we are creating something that's really intersecting, right? So like sound effects sometimes are going to function like score, and score sometimes is going to function like sound effects, but they really need to be melded into each other. And so the first question that was asked was, well, who goes first? Who's going to be responding to whose stuff? And I made the decision, and this is not a right decision or a wrong decision, I made the decision to start with sound. Because when I was editing, I had to create a soundscape. I just rebuilt, like I would say honestly, 70% of this film is just sound effects that I built from the bottom up, from just silent picture. And so Eric took that, made it better, also added his own interpretation to it through our conversation. And then that was what really helped inform the score. So when the score wouldn't get in the way of that and vice versa.
Yeah, because we talked about how, the observational style, documentary feel, cinema verite style gives this, this feeling of realness, but then the score, the score and the sound design is also lending this realness, this verisimilitude to the experience, but it's doing it by creating this sometimes artificial companion to it, and so that tension and paradox, and that we're reading it as real because we're having an emotional response to the sound, we're having an emotional response to the score, and I love the mixing of the two. I think about percussive sounds or musicality in the world, just in the environment, and so I really like hearing you talk about doing that and integrating that together.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's a really good point, Silas. Actually, that I just want to echo that you are and it also goes back to that first question of documentary versus narrative or reality versus fantasy, and that's also why I think this term hybrid cinema is somewhat problematic because, Silas, if I'm creating soundscapes that sound real but they're completely fabricated, I mean, who's to say what this is? You know what I mean? Is this documentary, is it narrative? If I'm working with non-professional actors, but they're working with blocking and monotonous lines, and they're eliciting an emotion that's completely fabricated. Is it a documentary still?
Can you address what you find problematic about the term hybrid? So do you guys understand this cinema is like exactly that, hybrid of narrative and documentary, right? A sort of blend of the style that's been around for a long time, as Garrett was pointing out. Do you want to just speak to what you find problematic about it?
Yeah, I guess I guess because I feel like it's sort of this pop culture redefining of something or it's not even redefining, it's just kind of relabeling something that, as I was kind of saying before, has existed for a long time. You guys are talking about post-World War cinema. That was coming out of a time period where resources were really low and catastrophe had just happened. And there were filmmakers who were responding to that on a creative level by all means necessary with resources that they had available to them without waiting for money or a studio or a huge camera, or trained actors. They really were it was a very kind of impulsive way of making work to a certain extent. And you see this returning I find, when the economy is bad, or like when we have these sort of shifts in culture. It happened again in the 1960s in California with Charles Burnett and Billy Woodbury, in the 1960s black cinema at UCLA, where you found filmmakers who were working with the communities that they came from, with non-professional actors, with like handheld cameras, and were creating these like very impressionistic personal interpretations of real life, you know what I mean? Constructions of real life. So then when we jump up to the 2000s, to rename it hybrid, to me, which is just such a simple thing, it's just saying, well, there's documentaries and then there's narratives, and then we're just gonna put these two things together, and that's called hybrid. When we know, because of our conversation even thus far, that there's so much malleability even within the definitions of those two genres alone, that to then just say, well, we're just gonna, first of all, they're just this and that, we're just gonna put them together, and we're just gonna call it hybrid. It sort of negates, I think, a tradition and process.
Yeah, and it speaks to a sort of amnesia in capitalism in general, where you have to rebrand something over and over again to get attention on it. And it's not addressing why Charles Burnett or myself or you would go into a non-traditional acting environment to tell the stories that we want to tell. That opens up a lot of who are the actors in LA, who are the, what are the problems of the whole system in terms of who's gonna be a professional actor, who's gonna be a professional director. All of these things are influenced by class and race and any number of things and influence it. So there's also other factors in play that hybrid it's reductive, right? So does it feel like a gentrification of that kind of filmmaking, or just an annoying term?
Yeah, I don't know if it's a gentrification, because I think it's because it's not coming from within. Like, in other words, it's really just a relabeling.
Yeah.
It's not like the process or anything has changed. It's just a new name that's being put on top of it. Gentrification feels like it comes kind of more from the bottom up a little bit, or from the top down, This is just sort of like just a new term for exactly, it's just, same product with a new label on it, and it's just sort of...
At least it's not what was the other terrible term? Mumblecore.
Oh, yeah, right, mumblecore. I mean, it's funny, my grandma sent me an article about mumblecore a couple of years ago, and I was like, cool, it's like people sitting in rooms, like, talking and stuff, like, I guess that's cool that there's a term for it. Well, we need these terms too, I don't want to sound too negative, like, we need language to define movements, right? And sometimes new labeling allows for the distinction, at least for the purposes of the future, when we look back on history. When we have new names, we can sort of identify, I guess, movements, we can create...
Brings it into a contemporary spotlight,
Yeah.
on the good,
exactly.
side. So, how about, let's see if you guys have any other questions about the film, about the process. Yeah.
Hi, I'm really curious just in terms of the whole Craigslist casting thing, and just really interested in that whole idea. And I'm wondering if after going through that, just in dealing with all the difficulties of doing it, is something you would do again. And I'm wondering, in the feature you're finishing editing now, did you cast it more traditionally, or can you do that kind of thing again?
Yeah, good question. It's hard to say for the future, because it's just process for me is so much about the story and about what it is I'm doing. So if it calls for it, certainly. I do really like working with trained actors too. It's a completely different process. Even working with Elliot, who was a trained actor, was a completely different thing than working with Leanne and Jermaine. It really just, I think the story dictates what that process is going to be. This most recent film was actually with a performance artist, so I would say that's a trained performer of sorts. But there's also a mix of people who I built relationships with in Below Dreams that also kind of have reappear in this film as well. Yeah.
How much did those conversations that you had during the casting and such influence what you then created later?
Sorry, it was breaking up. How much did the conversations influence?
Like you said that you met hundreds of people
Yeah.
in the casting. Would you say that affected a lot of what you then created, or would you say you had a pretty good idea before?
Yeah, no, it had already been set in stone. Just in terms of, I mean, the people who really influenced the script were the three people who I met on these bus rides. You know, that I focused in on those bus rides like a year prior, who I couldn't find again. And so what was so kind of magical about that rehearsal process and meeting those hundreds of people was that it validated the sort of universal story of those three people who I had met. Yeah.
And how much of the script, I love the way that you, because it's always an interesting process to pick the story or what stories we find or find us. So you have those three people that you interviewed. It's a long bus ride from LA to New Orleans. And but was it just one bus ride? Each person you had a tape recorded interview. Was it just one trip, or did you meet up with them again?
No, it was, well, okay, so it was like 4 or 5 37-hour bus rides that I was taking over the course of the year between New York and New Orleans. I was taking a lot of time on my hands. And I met tons of people and took tons of photos of different people and had tape recordings of lots of different people. I was doing couch surfing, just staying with people who I met once I got to New Orleans and continued my research. So of all of those transcripts, I then focused on 3 people specifically. I couldn't tell you which trip, honestly. I met each of them. It was just sort of like, I felt like, maybe on some subconscious level too, I felt like I could focus in on those 3 characters because I know I could direct those 3 kinds of characters, As a woman, I felt like I could, and as a woman who grew up with a single mother, I felt like I could really connect with in directing a single mother. As a Black woman, I felt who finds the South to be, complicated and interesting. I felt like I could engage with Jermaine, being a young Black man in the South. And with Elliot, obviously, having, I'm from New York City. I went to UCLA and Smith. I got private education. And I could sympathize, and I certainly know, I've got tons of friends who have a lot of resources and don't know what they're doing. So I could certainly,
Connect to that. Yeah, that's interesting. That's a great breakdown. Yeah,
This is just kind of like a random comment about one thing I loved about the movie that I think, in the very beginning of our conversation, you said that some people had a problem with the sort of movement in the film.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could just explain what their reception was.
Well, yeah, I had a friend who, during one of the screenings, because I don't sit in all the time when the film is screening, and I was just in the lobby, and I had a friend come out, and she was like gonna puke. Like, she literally, she has motion sickness, so it's not totally, the film's fault, but that's just an example, I think, where I think that the movement, for some people, just can't really stomach it, which is just what it is, That's just the reality of the work,
I really like it. There's lots of things that might not, I'm trying to make sense of some things that might not seem to correlate. But when we're thinking about language, and we just read this essay about the quotidian, and you're talking about like in some way we have to find a language to make sense of these new visualities that we're making sense it with. And we'll say quotidian over and over and over again, try to talk about everyday life, but it's not really a good word. And I just think that when there are certain types of people, types of characters that are really shown on the screen, and I really like the movement because it sort of, to me, enhanced this new confrontation with the everyday that we don't always get to see. And I don't know. I think one of the things I'm really concerned with or interested in or want to think about a lot in the sort of movies that I want to make is how do I reveal some aspect of everyday life and deny meaning for it, or I don't know how to explain it, but I worry about trying to create a language for every sort of new visual experience that we have.
Mm-hmm.
I guess because language distances us from reality. So like,
Right.
it's kind of paradoxical because, you know,
Very
I'm trying to present reality and I'm saying don't make a language about it because I want people to see it as their own.
Right.
I don't know if that makes sense. So,
Absolutely. Yeah, the paradox in cinema especially is very, I think, alive and complicated. But were you able to hear her, Garrett?
Yeah, I mean, when you're talking about language, and I'm like, what? I like trying to understand a little bit what you're saying. I think I did hear what you're saying, like that that there's in I guess observation, you want to create a bit of distance visually with like you have language and conversations and you capture them in a specific way and trying to create neutrality maybe in that depiction, or tell me if I'm getting that wrong.
yeah, I don't know if it's neutrality. I guess it's low dreams. In my viewing of it, really played with this in a really interesting way, where I felt like I was there and I felt like specifically like the life of, or just like the fragment of the life of Jermaine that I was able to witness. I felt like that was really powerful, and it made me think about how if you want to tell stories about real life, it's going to open you up to a whole world that we never usually see. And at the same time, like the movie, like to me, denies what sort of meaning we should give to Jermaine's current struggle. How should we understand his desire to get rid of his goatee in order to become successful? Because I'm completely against that. Like, I mean, I'm idealist. Like, I think that's a huge problem in our culture, that we think that people who dress a certain way or look a certain way don't give off connotations of capacity or something like that. But at the same time, I found myself being like, this is what he needs to do in order. Like, I couldn't, you know.
You were open to this experience.
I was open to Jermaine's experience in a way that I wasn't expecting. So I felt, it's just a comment about lots of things that the movie did for me.
Yeah, I think, I'm sorry, I was like trying to listen intently, and I think you bring up some interesting points, and I mean, on one hand, there's also like, you know, how style comes into play with depicting this quote unquote real life, right? And I think it's an, you know, as a filmmaker, there's sort of a style I think that's happening right now that's really more about like tone for me, right? There's like I feel like I've seen a lot of films with like, that take place in the suburbs with like people on bikes, with like tracking shots of people on bikes, and like smoking cigarettes, like teenagers smoking cigarettes by like water or something, or like, you know, and they're very like quiet, and it's mostly just you observing them hanging out. And I think that, you know, certainly this film does do that in a certain kind of way, but I also was trying to create a space so that there could be a real meaningful dialogue and a moment where someone like Jermaine, for instance, and Desmond could have a very intimate conversation that I felt needed to be heard by the public, because it could counteract the these perceptions that we have when you see two black men sitting on a porch or standing on a corner. The assumption of what it is that they're talking about or what it is that they're doing, could the possibility of that being contradicted through through being able to sit and listen is where the power of film is, and the power of direction. So yeah, and that was oh man, there was another thing I was going to say that.
That's a really, I love that, both Alexis's question and your response to that. You know, we've been looking at the complications of narrative, you know, the power and danger of storytelling and the ways that we look at story and the different approaches. And so I think your film, like what you were saying in terms, what Alexis was saying in terms of Jermaine and the response and this nuanced experience where we have our credos, you know, what we think we know about ourselves or our opinions, and then we are open to interacting with those and having them be explored through the style of storytelling of cinema that was really, you know, powerful, right? So, but that is the way that strategy that you have, this conversation, all of those things that you just said about what is assumed and sitting for a long, listening to the conversation from beginning to end, these are all kind of strategies that are what we're calling language, and we're looking at different cinematic strategies. These are specific ones that you're employing, so it's great because it's breaking down theory into like, here's what you went into this film with, and here's how like the long shot, this one long take, here's the camera moving and staying, very intimate, and what are these ways that it's translating to us, so.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I don't know what all, it's exciting to kind of watch and hear you talk about what you went into the project with, and I know we have to wrap up. You don't have to because I don't want to make you explain, but in terms of the title, Below Dreams, I love the title, and if there's something that you would add to it, or if it takes the mystery away of it, it's very, poetic and very clear, all the different meanings, but if you would speak to it.
Yeah, I have such a hard time with titles. Everything I come up with just feels so cheesy. I hate having to do it. But, I listen to a lot of rap music. That's been my music since growing up. And there's a lot of references to glass ceilings, especially in like contemporary pop rap right now. And I think that just that image of a glass ceiling is what really, I think, defines at least my generation really well, of like being able to see something that you're aspiring to, and yet there's this very, very strong block sometimes for that, which isn't always as apparent as we kind of recognize. So the title itself I could have just called it Glass Ceilings, man. That's what I should have done, really. But
no, Below Dreams is great. I love it.
Yeah. Well, Below Dreams to me is just sort of like an obvious reference to space and how like our dreams are above us, and we're physically stuck to the ground. So, yeah.
Well, thank you. I could talk for hours with you, but I really appreciate your time and your beautiful film.
Yeah, you guys are great, and I really, I'd love to see some of your work too, if you ever put it up somewhere or something, and if you ever have questions or whatever, feel free to reach out to me too. You can get my info from Silas. So.
Good, so I can give them your email, and we'll stay in touch if you all have questions that you weren't able to ask in this time frame. That would be great, Garrett. Thank you.
Yeah.
They're a great bunch, so I'm excited that we all get to meet. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So much. I'm gonna take a screenshot of y'all. All right. See you later.
All right. Bye. Bye. Good job. Okay. Here we go. There we go. All right. We ran a little bit over.